The teaching room on the 4th floor of Hargrove Medical Center held 23 people that Wednesday morning. Residents, medical students, 2 attending physicians, and 1 man with a mop. The man with the mop was not supposed to be part of the lesson. He had come in through the side door, the way custodial staff always did, to deal with a biohazard spill near the rear supply cabinet that had been called in 40 minutes earlier. His cart squeaked slightly on the linoleum. His name tag read Marcus. His gray uniform said Facilities. He moved toward the back of the room with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years learning to take up exactly no space in places like this. Dr. Katherine Mercer did not look up from her slide when he entered. She was midway through a presentation that had been 6 years in the making, a surgical approach to hemorrhagic control in penetrating abdominal trauma that she had presented at 2 national conferences, published in 3 peer-reviewed journals, and was now teaching to the next generation of trauma surgeons at Hargrove Medical Center. The central insight of this technique, Dr. Mercer said, clicking to the next slide, is the sequential vessel isolation protocol. You don't chase the bleed, you control the architecture. A resident in the 3rd row raised his hand. Was this approach derived from earlier literature, or, "It was derived from my research," Dr. Mercer said. 7 years of it. At the back of the room, Marcus reached the supply cabinet. He set down his mop and opened the chemical kit. He did not look at the slide. He did not need to. He had seen those diagrams before. He had drawn the first version of them himself, by hand, in a notebook that no longer existed, in a hospital that had not yet become what it now was, in a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. He said nothing. He had not planned to say anything, but then Dr. Mercer clicked to slide 14, and Marcus looked up, and the diagram on the screen was the one, the specific sequencing of vascular clamps, the approach angle, the notation in the lower left corner that her team had slightly modified but not enough to change what it fundamentally was. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked back down at the chemical kit. Someone else in the room noticed him looking. A 3rd-year resident named Amara, seated near the aisle, watched the custodian's face change and then carefully change back, and filed the observation somewhere in her mind without fully knowing why. Then Dr. Mercer noticed him too. "Excuse me." Her voice was sharp and sudden, cutting across the murmur of the room. "What are you doing in here?" Marcus looked up. "There was a biohazard call on the cabinet back here, ma'am. I'll be out of your way in. This is a closed teaching session." She crossed her arms. Her voice had not lowered. "You cannot be in this room. Do you understand? This is not a hallway. This is not a supply closet. There are physicians in this room and confidential patient imaging on that screen." She turned slightly to include the residents in what came next, a practiced movement that said she was not embarrassed to use an audience. "Is there a sign on that door?" "Yes, ma'am. And you came in anyway." "I was called in by Facilities Dispatch." "The spill?" "I don't care about the spill." Her voice was flat and final. "I care about 23 people whose time you are wasting. Get your cart and get out." The room was very quiet. 22 faces pointed at one man in a gray uniform holding a chemical kit. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to correct anything. Marcus closed the kit. He picked up the mop handle. He looked at Dr. Mercer with an expression that held nothing she could push against. No anger, no embarrassment, no wounded pride. Just a quiet, level attention that lasted exactly 1 second longer than she expected. And then he turned toward the door. He was 3 steps from it when Dr. Osei walked in. Before this morning was over, Katherine Mercer would say something in front of that room that she could never take back. And the man she had just dismissed would say almost nothing at all. "If you've ever been treated like you didn't belong in the room you built, this one is for you. Stay with us." Marcus Cole had a system for weekday mornings, and it never changed. He picked Lily up from Mrs. Patterson's by 7, stopped at the bakery on Clement Street for 2 plain croissants and 1 small orange juice, and had her settled at the kitchen table with her reading workbook before 8. By 8:30 she was dropped at school. By 9 he was in the facilities locker room at Hargrove Medical Center, changing into the gray uniform with the small embroidered name tag that said only what he had agreed it should say. Marcus, not Dr. Cole. Not Dr. Marcus A. Cole, M.D., FACS, just Marcus, the way he had wanted it. It was not a glamorous life, but it was a chosen one, and Marcus had spent enough years learning the difference to understand that chosen was worth more than most people gave it credit for. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that men who had once been athletes remained broad-shouldered long after the competition ended. His face had settled into the kind of stillness that came not from peace exactly, but from having survived enough that the small disturbances no longer registered the way they once had. He wore his gray uniform the same way he had once worn surgical scrubs, without vanity, without complaint, with the particular indifference to appearance of someone whose relationship with clothing had always been entirely functional. Lily was 7. She had her mother's mouth and her father's habit of watching rooms before she entered them, a quality that her teachers called perceptive and that Marcus recognized as the early formation of something he had spent his entire career trying to cultivate in surgical residence. The ability to see what was actually there, not what you expected to find. She also had an uncomplicated belief that her father was the smartest person she had ever met, which Marcus did not argue with. Not because he thought it was true, but because a child's faith in you was not the kind of thing you argued with. You tried to be worthy of it quietly, from the inside out, and you hoped the distance between what you were and what they believed about you was not so wide that it could never be crossed. He had taken the facilities job 14 months ago, 3 months after he had left Hargrove's surgical staff, and 6 months after the review board had cleared him of the complaint that had triggered his resignation. Cleared completely. No findings, no sanctions, nothing on the record. Just the particular exhaustion of having been correct all along about a situation that had cost him 18 months of his life to navigate. The complaint had come from a colleague, not a patient. A disagreement about surgical approach on a complex trauma case that had escalated through channels Marcus hadn't anticipated and landed in places he hadn't wanted. He had been right about the approach. The patient had survived. The colleague had moved on to a position in Atlanta where he presumably continued disagreeing with people he found inconvenient. Marcus had looked at the cleared finding and understood with a clarity that surprised even him that he did not want to go back. Not to the hours, not to the politics, not to the specific, grinding exhaustion of operating inside a system that had spent 1.5 years treating his professional judgment as a question to be investigated rather than a fact to be respected. What he had wanted, and what he now had, was proximity without performance. He wanted to be in the hospital. He wanted to walk its corridors and know that somewhere in those rooms, trauma surgeons were using a protocol that had taken him 8 years to develop and refine and test and revise. He wanted to be close to the work without being consumed by it. He wanted to pick Lily up before 8 and have croissants on Clement Street and drop her at school and be present for the ordinary structure of her days in a way that surgery at the level he had practiced it had never allowed. He wanted to be just Marcus for a while. He had been wrong about how simple that would turn out to be. But he would not fully understand that until Wednesday morning. The only people at Hargrove who knew who he was were Dr. Raymond Osei, the chief of surgery, who had personally asked Marcus to take the facility's position, not as charity, but because having Marcus Cole inside the hospital walls, even in maintenance, made Osei feel that the building was more capable than its org chart suggested, and a charge nurse named Gloria, who had scrubbed beside Marcus on 140 cases over 11 years, and who, when she first saw him in the gray uniform, had looked at him for a long moment and said only, "You eating enough?" Everyone else saw the cart. They saw the gray uniform. They saw a large, quiet black man who moved through the hospital's corridors with the unhurried steadiness of someone whose job was to make the floor look like nothing difficult had ever happened on it. Which was true. That was just never the only true thing. Dr. Katherine Mercer had arrived at Hargrove Medical Center 4 years ago from a trauma fellowship in Baltimore that she had completed with distinction, and she had understood from her first week that Hargrove's trauma department rewarded people who moved fast, published often, and did not wait for permission to claim the space in front of them. She was 38 years old, precise in the way that competitive people were precise. Not meticulous by nature, but meticulous by discipline, the way a person becomes meticulous when the consequences of imprecision are public and permanent. She was good at her job. This was not in dispute. She was excellent at her job, and the people who worked under her knew it, and the people above her knew it, and she knew it herself with a certainty that did not require external validation, which was both her greatest professional asset and the quality that made the space around her slightly airless on difficult days. The surgical technique she had presented at the American College of Surgeons conference 2 years ago had generated real attention. The paper had been downloaded 14,000 times. 3 other trauma programs had implemented variations of the approach. She had been nominated for a departmental teaching award. Her division head had described her in an annual review as the most significant clinical contributor the department had seen in a decade. What Dr. Mercer did not know, what almost no one currently at Hargrove knew, was where the foundational technique had actually come from. The sequential vessel isolation protocol had been developed between 2013 and 2017 by Marcus Cole, then chief of trauma surgery at Hargrove, in collaboration with a vascular fellow named James Webb, who had since relocated to a program in Houston. They had published it in a small subspecialty journal under a title that prioritized precision over memorability, and it had been cited enough times in the subsequent literature to influence the field without ever becoming famous in the way that certain papers became famous. It had been absorbed into the institutional knowledge of Hargrove's trauma department the way water absorbed into ground, quietly, completely, without announcement. When Dr. Mercer arrived at Hargrove in her fellowship year, the protocol was already embedded in the department's standard of care. She had learned it the way you learned institutional knowledge, from attending physicians who taught it without tracing its origin, from surgical logs that documented outcomes without noting lineage, from the accumulation of watching it work until it became, in her mind and the minds of everyone who trained alongside her, simply the way things were done. She had not stolen it. She had expanded it, refined 3 elements of the timing sequence, published the expansion under her own name with acknowledgement of the existing literature in terms general enough that they did not land on anything specific. She had done what ambitious people and institutions did when they encountered knowledge that existed without attribution. She had made it hers, not through malice, but through the ordinary momentum of a career that had always moved in one direction. She had genuinely not known whose work it was when she first published. By the time she might have known, it was hers in every practical sense. Her name was on 3 papers. Her voice was in the lectures. Her photograph was on the conference program. And the man who had built the foundation she was standing on was mopping floors 2 buildings over, picking his daughter up by 7. Stopping for croissants on Clement Street, being just Marcus. Marcus had known about the publications since the first one appeared. He had read the paper twice. He had noted what she had kept and what she had changed, and he had concluded, with the equanimity of a man who had thought carefully about which things were worth spending himself on, that this was not one of them. The protocol was in use. Patients were surviving. The name attached to it was the kind of detail that mattered to careers, and he had stepped away from the version of his life that organized itself around his career. He had been at peace with that conclusion for over a year. He would not be at peace with it after Wednesday. Wednesday's teaching session had been on the facility's calendar for 6 weeks. Marcus had flagged the setup request himself. 4th floor conference room, 7:30 a.m. Biohazard protocol cabinet maintenance required. A reagent bottle with a loose seal. Standard procedure. He had built the task into his morning the same way he built everything, without drama, without significance beyond the work itself. He arrived at 7:50 after the session was already in progress, and slipped through the side door without disrupting the flow of the presentation. He moved to the rear of the room. The spill was minor, already contained. He opened the kit and began working. For the first 4 minutes, he did not look at the screen. He had no reason to. He was focused on the containment protocol, on doing the task correctly and getting out before he became a presence anyone needed to account for. Then he looked up. Slide 14. The sequential isolation diagram, the clamp positioning, the approach angles he had sketched first on a legal pad in his old office at 11 in the evening, after a case that had gone sideways in a way that showed him the exact shape of what the existing literature was missing. The notation in the lower left corner where he had once written Cole Webb Protocol, Draft 4, revised January 2017, and which now read simply Dr. K. Mercer, Hargrove Trauma Surgery. He looked at it for 3 seconds. He looked away. Then Dr. Mercer looked at him. The dismissal arrived quickly, the way dismissals did when they were not the product of thought but of reflex. She looked at the gray uniform. She looked at the cart. She made a calculation that took less time than drawing a breath and delivered its conclusion with the smooth, unhesitating confidence of someone who had never once been asked to reconsider the same kind of calculation in the past. This is a closed teaching session. Get your cart and get out. The room was quiet. 22 faces. The chemical kit. The mop handle. The door. Marcus did not argue. He did not explain. He did not say, "I know that diagram." I do not say that to you as a challenge or a correction or an accusation. I say it because I built it and it works, and 12 years from now residents you have not yet met will use it to save people whose names they will never know. And that is the entire point of the work and has always been the entire point of the work. He said none of that. He closed the kit. He picked up the mop handle. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has processed what is happening and decided, not for the first time in his life, not even for the 100th, that the moment did not call for his voice. He turned toward the door, 3 steps, and then the door opened from the other side, and Dr. Raymond Osei stepped through it. Osei was 61 years old and had been chief of surgery at Hargrove for 14 years. He was a compact man with the deliberate quality of movement that came from having spent decades in operating rooms where precision was not a preference but a condition of the work. He entered rooms at the speed the moment required and not 1 step faster. He was carrying a coffee cup and a folder, and was clearly in transit to something else when he stepped through the door of the teaching room, saw Marcus near the exit, and stopped. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the projection screen. He looked at slide 14. Something moved across his face. Fast, almost imperceptible. The expression of a man whose memory has just delivered information that reorganizes the meaning of everything currently in his field of vision. He looked at the diagram. He looked at the notation in the lower left corner. He looked at Marcus again. "Marcus," he said, quietly, "don't go." The room turned. 23 faces reoriented toward the door, toward the chief of surgery standing with his coffee cup, toward the custodian with the mop handle, toward the particular quality of attention that Osei was extending to a man in a gray facilities uniform. Dr. Mercer turned from the screen. She did not yet understand what she was seeing, but she understood that whatever it was not what she had expected when Dr. Osei walked through the door. "Ray," she said, because she was one of the few people in the department who called him that. "I was just asking facilities to clear the room before Katherine." His voice was quiet in the way that certain kinds of authority were quiet. Not because they lacked force, but because they didn't need it. "I need you to hold for a moment." He set his coffee cup on a desk near the door. He walked to the front of the room. He stood in front of the projection screen and looked at slide 14 the way a person looked at something they recognized from a long time ago and had not expected to find in this particular place. "That diagram," he said, addressing the room rather than Dr. Mercer. "The sequential isolation protocol, the vessel architecture, the clamp sequencing in that specific order." He pointed to the notation in the lower left corner. That notation. Dr. Mercer's posture adjusted slightly. A small recalibration. "I developed it during my fellowship based on the department's existing standard of care and my own subsequent." "Marcus?" Osei said. He had not looked away from the screen. "Come here, please." Something happened in the room that was not quite a sound, more like the collective suspension of breath. 23 people holding something without knowing why. Marcus walked to the front of the room. He walked the way he always walked, without hurry, without performance. The gray uniform and the work boots and the name tag that said only Marcus. He stopped beside Osei. He looked at the screen. He looked at slide 14 the way a person looked at something they had spent a long time not looking at. Osei said, "I want to ask you something in front of this room, and I want you to answer honestly, even though I already know the answer. He paused. Do you recognize this diagram? Marcus looked at it for a moment. Then, yes. Can you tell these residents where it came from? A longer pause. The room was completely still. The resident named Amara, who had watched Marcus's face change at slide 14 40 minutes ago and had not said anything about it, was sitting very straight. I developed it, Marcus said, between 2013 and 2017, with a vascular fellow named James Webb. We published it in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery in 2018, Sequential Vascular Control in Penetrating Abdominal Trauma, an Architectural Approach. It was the department's standard of care before Dr. Mercer arrived here. The room processed this in absolute silence. Dr. Mercer's face moved through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief was the first one. The natural response of a person who has been told something that structurally cannot be true and has not yet located the information that would make it true. Then something more complicated came in beneath it. A recalculation. Fast and involuntary. Her mind pulling every piece of available information about the man standing in front of her and arriving, very quickly, at a version of the morning that was entirely different from the one she had built her presentation around. She began. Marcus Cole, Jose said, formerly chief of trauma surgery at this institution, author of the Cole-Webb protocol that you have been teaching to these residents. He said it without cruelty, but without softening it either. Some things needed to arrive at their full weight to mean what they needed to mean. Dr. Cole took leave from surgical practice 14 months ago. He has been working in our facilities department at his own request for personal reasons that are his alone to characterize. The residents were watching Dr. Mercer. The students were watching her. Amara was watching her with the expression of someone whose early observation has just been confirmed in a way she had not anticipated. Dr. Mercer looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her. She had, 40 minutes ago, told him that 23 people were wasting their time because of his presence in the room. She had gestured at an audience to amplify the dismissal. She had looked at a gray uniform and a mop handle and made a complete and instantaneous determination about what she was looking at. And that determination had been so total, so comfortable, so entirely consistent with every similar determination she had made in rooms like this one across a decade of professional life, that she had never once asked herself whether it might be something other than accurate. Now she was standing at the front of a room she had commanded for the past hour, and the room had quietly restructured itself around her while she wasn't paying attention to anything except the slide she was presenting, and the man she had dismissed was standing beside her department chief, and the diagram on the screen behind her was not what she had been saying it was. I didn't know, she said. Her voice had lost the precision of earlier. Not completely, but enough to be audible. I want to be clear about that. When I encountered this approach, it wasn't attributed. The literature I was trained on, the way it came to me in this department, nothing connected it to a specific author. I know, Marcus said. It was the first thing he had said that wasn't a direct answer to a direct question. He said it simply, without anger, without the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and is finally standing inside it. I know you didn't know, he said. That is actually a separate problem. Jose asked the residents to take a 10-minute break. They filed out with the careful, attentive quiet of people who understood they had witnessed something important and were still sorting out how to hold it. Amara was the last to leave. She paused at the door and looked at Marcus with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a statement. Something between the two, something that would resolve itself later, she suspected, in the middle of a night shift when she had time to sit with it. Marcus gave her a small nod that acknowledged it without explaining it. The three of them stood in the empty room. The projector hummed. Slide 14 stayed on the screen. Jose spoke first. Katherine, I want you to hear what I'm about to say clearly, because I'm going to say it once. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had been navigating difficult conversations for 4 decades and had lost the appetite for anything but straight lines. This protocol has your name on 3 publications and 2 major conference presentations. The acknowledgement sections in those papers do not specifically cite the Cole-Webb work, That is an attribution problem that is going to need to be corrected, formally, in writing, with each journal, and with the conference proceedings where it's possible. Dr. Mercer nodded. She looked like she had more to say, and was choosing not to say it yet. That is also, Osei continued, separate from what happened in this room this morning. Dr. Mercer looked at Marcus. The ventilation system hummed. The projector hummed. Outside in the corridor, the quiet sounds of a working hospital continued their ordinary rhythm, indifferent to what was happening inside this room. I spoke to you the way I did because of what you were wearing, she said. It was not a question. She was naming a finding, the way she named findings in difficult cases, plainly, without flinching from the accuracy of it. Not because of anything you did or said, because of what you looked like when you walked through the door. Marcus said nothing. I have done that before, she said. Not always in those words, not always out loud. But the calculation, I have made it. I make it without knowing I'm making it, which is its own problem. I didn't understand the shape of it until I was standing here looking at you and at that diagram and at 14 months of whatever this has been. She paused. I didn't know I was doing it. That doesn't make it not the thing that I was doing. It was the most honest thing she had said all morning. It landed differently than anything else had. Not with the clean force of a confrontation, but with the duller, more substantial weight of someone recognizing something true about themselves in a public room and choosing not to retreat from it. Marcus looked at her. He thought about 14 months of gray uniforms. He thought about the particular texture of invisibility that came not from cruelty but from assumption, the way people moved around him in corridors not with hostility, but with the effortless, unconscious ease of people who had already decided what he was and had been given no reason to revisit the decision. He thought about his father. His father had worked as an orderly in a hospital not unlike this one for 19 years. Not because he lacked the capacity for something else, but because the something else had not been available to a black man with his education and his era. His father had come home every evening and sat at the kitchen table and been quiet for a while before he could fully become himself again. Marcus had understood even as a child what his father was setting down, what he was trying to leave at the door. What his father had given him was not bitterness. It was a question. The question his father had asked him once, sitting on the back porch in Oakland after Marcus came home furious about something a teacher had assumed without asking. The question isn't whether they're wrong about you. The question is whether you're going to let what they think determine what you do. Marcus had been asking himself that question for 31 years. He looked at Dr. Mercer. He said, I didn't leave surgery because of the review board. I was cleared. I left because I was tired. Not of the work is the only thing I have ever been completely certain of. I was tired of spending a third of my attention managing what people assumed about me the moment I walked into a room. I wanted a year of something simpler. I wanted to be somewhere without a title attached to my name. I wanted to see what that felt like. He looked at slide 14. And then I walked through a door and found out that the simpler version of me was easier to dismiss than I had accounted for. He turned back to her. Which I should have known. You learn that early. Sometimes you just have to walk into something to understand how far it actually goes. Dr. Mercer held his gaze. She did not look away. Osei set his coffee cup down and said, quietly, What do you want to do, Marcus? Marcus looked at the diagram. He looked at the notation in the lower left corner. He thought about it, not performing the consideration but actually sitting inside it, the way he had sat inside difficult decisions in operating rooms when the body on the table was depending on him to think rather than react. Correct the record, he said, in the publications. Make the attribution accurate. Osei nodded. And finish the session, Marcus said. Osei looked at him. You want to? These are third-year residents, Marcus said. They are about to go into trauma surgery. They should know where this technique came from. They should know how it was built and what problem it was built to solve, and what the original reasoning was. He looked at Dr. Mercer steadily. She knows the expanded version. She has made real improvements to it. Both things can be true at the same time. The residents came back in 9 minutes. They returned to their seats with the careful, searching energy of people who were not entirely certain what they were returning to, and then they saw what was at the front of the room and they settled. Marcus Cole stood at the projection screen. He had set the mop against the wall near the supply cabinet. He had not changed his uniform. He was in the gray facilities shirt with the small name tag and the work boots. And he was looking at slide 14, and the room was very quiet. Dr. Mercer sat in the front row. She had moved from behind the podium without being asked. A deliberate movement, the physical gesture of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before she can reconsider. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the screen. Marcus said, "The problem we were trying to solve in 2013 was specific. You have a patient with penetrating abdominal trauma, multiple vessel involvement. You are losing them on the table, and every approach in the existing literature tells you to chase the source of the bleed. The problem is that by the time you locate and address it, the pursuit itself has created 3 additional hemorrhage points. You are fighting a war on the wrong front." He picked up the marker from the whiteboard tray and drew the diagram from memory. Not slowly, not for effect. Quickly, with the clean efficiency of someone who has drawn something 10,000 times and whose hand knows the shape before the mind fully catches up. The lines appeared with a precision that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine familiarity. "The architectural insight," he said, "is this. You don't chase the bleed because the bleed is a symptom of a structural problem. You address the structure. You isolate in sequence, proximal to distal, largest to smallest, and you allow the architecture of the vasculature itself to do the work the hemorrhage has been doing against it." He drew the clamp positions. He wrote the sequencing. He annotated the timing windows in the specific order that he and James Webb had arrived at over the course of 2 years and 47 cases and arguments conducted over cold coffee in a hospital office at midnight. The room was completely still. A second-year resident in the middle row had his pen moving continuously, not taking conventional notes, but drawing what Marcus was drawing, matching it line for line. The focused urgency of someone who does not want to lose something they can feel is important even before they fully understand why. Marcus taught for 22 minutes. He taught the way he had always taught, without performance, without the self-consciousness of a person aware of an audience, with the concentrated presence of someone for whom the subject matter was not a topic but a living thing he had spent years trying to understand and was now trying to give to people who would carry it forward. He taught about the cases where the protocol had failed and what the failures had revealed about its limits. He taught about the modification he would have made in 2019 if he had still been practicing. The one that Dr. Mercer had, he said quietly, independently arrived at in her 2021 paper. He looked at Dr. Mercer when he said it. He said it was the right call, and he meant it without any irony, because it was true and because truth did not require the context to be comfortable in order to be accurate. Dr. Mercer listened. She did not move to reclaim the room. She sat in the front row, and she listened to a man who had built the foundation she had been standing on, and she let the weight of that sit on her without managing it. Amara had stopped writing. She was watching Marcus's hands at the whiteboard, the economy of the movement, the way nothing was wasted. She would think about this room for a long time afterward. She would think about the gray uniform and the name tag that said only Marcus and the 3 seconds at slide 14 when a man's face had briefly shown something before putting it carefully away. She would think about what it meant that she had noticed and had said nothing, and she would decide, sitting in this room at 26 years old at the beginning of what she hoped would be a long career, that this was the last time she let a room's silence determine what she was willing to name. When Marcus finished, he set the marker down. He looked at the residents. "Dr. Mercer will be correcting the attribution in her published work," he said. "The technique will be properly credited going forward. I want you to understand why that matters, not for my benefit, but because accurate attribution in medicine is how the field learns. When you do not know where something came from, you cannot understand why it was built the way it was, and you cannot improve it with any real intelligence. You can only iterate on what you've inherited." He looked at the room one last time. Questions, silence for 2 seconds. Then the second-year resident in the middle row, the one who had been drawing the diagram line for line, raised his hand. "Would you be willing to come back?" he said. To teach again? Several other hands went up before Marcus answered. He looked at those hands. He looked at the room, at the residents with their notebooks, at the students in the back row who had come in expecting a standard teaching session and had gotten something they would be describing to people for years, at Dr. Mercer in the front row with her hands in her lap and her eyes open. "I'll think about it," he said. It was not a no, and everyone in the room understood the difference. The session ended at 9:45. The residents filed out, and this time they carried the energy of people who had been given something real, turning it over in their hands as they walked, feeling the weight and shape of it, already thinking about how it changed the thing they thought they knew. Amara stopped near the door. She looked at Marcus. Then she said, plainly and without ceremony, "Thank you." 2 words. Undecorated. The way you said something when you meant it entirely and had decided that any addition would only dilute it. Marcus nodded. She walked out. Dr. Mercer stood. She and Marcus were the only ones left in the room. Osei had stepped out during the final minutes. He had always known when a room needed fewer people in it to complete its work. "I'm going to fix the publications," she said. "All of them. I'm going to send formal corrections to each journal and reach out to every conference proceeding where I still have access. And I'm going to write to the surgeons I know who have implemented this protocol and tell them what the attribution should have been." Marcus looked at her. "You don't have to do all of that." "I know," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." She paused. "You asked me to apologize to the room this morning, in effect, by asking Ray to bring this into the open in front of it. I'm asking now without the room." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry. For this morning. For how quickly I decided what you were worth before you said a single word." Marcus said, "I know you didn't know who I was. That's what I'm apologizing for," she said. "The not knowing, the not asking, the deciding before." Honest enough that Marcus had nothing to add to it. He picked up the mop from the wall. He picked up the chemical kit. He walked to the door, and then he stopped. "The distal release timing in your 2021 paper," he said. "I would not have arrived at that for at least another 3 years, working from where I left off." He looked at her. "That is real work. Don't let the correction make you forget that." He walked out into the corridor. The floors were clean. They were always clean. He had made sure of that. He pushed the cart toward the elevator. The wheels squeaked against the linoleum. Around him, Hargrove Medical Center moved in the ordinary rhythm of a working hospital. Orderlies passing, monitors signaling from behind closed doors, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular quality of recycled air that Marcus had breathed for more years of his life than he could easily count. He pressed the button for the lobby. He stood in the elevator with the cart and the chemical kit and the gray uniform with the name tag that said only Marcus. He looked at his reflection in the brushed steel doors. The broad shoulders, the face that had learned to stay neutral in rooms where it didn't belong. The name that told you exactly as much as he had decided, for 14 months, that it needed to tell you. He looked like exactly what he was, which had always been the whole point, and which was, he understood now standing in this elevator, going to stop being the whole point very soon. At 2:45 that afternoon, he picked Lily up from school. She came through the gate with her backpack overfull and her shoelace undone, and a drawing rolled under her arm that she announced immediately was a horse. He said it looked like a horse. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most evaluations and decided he was right. They stopped at the bakery on Clement Street. She had the orange juice, he had the coffee. They sat at the window table and she unrolled the drawing on the small table and pointed out specific things she wanted him to notice. The tail, the way the mane was moving, the small figure standing beside the horse that she said was him. He asked how she knew it was him. She pointed to the figure. "Because it's the biggest person," she said simply. "And it's standing next to the horse, but it's not telling the horse what to do, it's just there with it." Marcus looked at the drawing. He looked at the small figure beside the horse. He looked at his daughter's face, serious and satisfied and entirely unconcerned with whether her answer made complete sense to anyone else. He thought about the room that morning. About slide 14 and 23 faces and a mop handle and the chief of surgery walking through a door with a coffee cup and changing what everything meant. He thought about a second-year resident drawing a diagram line for line with the urgent focus of someone trying to hold on to something important. He thought about what it would mean to walk back into that room not as just Marcus but as all of it at once. Everything the gray uniform had been containing for 14 months. He wasn't certain yet, but he was considerably less certain than he had been this morning that the answer was no. He rolled up Lily's drawing carefully, the way she preferred, with the horse's head facing outward. He tucked it under his arm. "Let's go," he said. She took his hand, and they walked out into the afternoon, past the bakery window and down the block, and into the ordinary, irreplaceable business of whatever came next. The room you built does not disappear because your name isn't on the door. The work you leave behind keeps moving, through the people trained on it, through the patients who survive because of it, through the hands that carry it forward without knowing whose hands first shaped it. What you are does not stop being true because no one in the room has thought to ask. It is still there. It was always there. The only question is whether the room will be honest enough to look. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that what you carry quietly is still yours, and that the people who dismiss you before you speak are telling you something important about themselves, not about you. Subscribe for more stories like this one. There is more coming.